Time to look at how we can actually help develop our adaptive immune system. The learning intention for today is to understand that exposure to an antigen is required for adaptive immunity. This may be acquired through passive or active processes. So, just a quick recap. Remember, we need to be able to form memory T cells to ensure that we have a quicker response time the second time or sequential times we get infected. And we also need the activation of B cells so that they can create B memory cells, and this is also stimulated by our helper T cells. Now, the reason why this is so important is because the first time we get exposed to an antigen, we call this the primary response. So, obviously, we've got our initial exposure, and then we've got our primary immune response here. So this has reached its peak, and this is where we've got an increased number of antibodies to that specific pathogen. When we have second exposure, so the antibodies have gone back down because we've recovered from our infection, but now instead of having zero antibodies like we have had in the past, um, we've now got a baseline, I guess you could say, of antigens um, from the B and T cells that have that memory of that specific antigen. So we've got a second exposure now, and you can see here that the response in the same amount of, or even slightly less amount of time, we've got a faster and um, a more productive production of antigens to fight off that pathogen. Okay, so their second response time is a lot quicker and effective. So, our active immunity occurs when our own immune system is responsible for protecting us from a pathogen, right? So, there are two types of active immunity. So, the first one is just a natural exposure to an infection, and the second one is vaccination, which is obviously artificial. So, if we do rely on our natural exposure to a pathogen, then there is a chance that we can develop more severe symptoms of that pathogen. So, this here is an example of herpes zoster or shingles, and this came about because someone who'd never been vaccinated before for um, chickenpox got a secondary infection that resulted in shingles. Now, shingles is extremely painful, and you often encounter people who will describe their life as before shingles and after shingles, and this could have been prevented through a vaccine. But of course, because this is that natural immunity, um, your body still has been able to produce all those antigens and have those memory B and T cells to re um, protect you and reignite all of those different responses to that specific pathogen again. I guess the only downside to that natural immunity is that you do have to experience the not so pleasant and nasty symptoms. Vaccines, of course, are an artificial form of active immunity, and they do stimulate antibodies being created due to an exposure to a weakened or killed pathogen and its antigens. So the body is then able to create antibodies and is able to then remember them if you do get a reinfection or actually get properly exposed to the virus or pathogen or whatever it is you got the vaccine against. So, of course, we know vaccines have been a very hot topic when it came to COVID-19, and it still is in other pathogens and things that, as being something that people that don't really want to have. So, with vaccines, the good thing about them is that they do allow you to get those antibodies without as much risk of getting the nasty symptoms as this person with shingles here has gotten. You can see here there's these two kids and well, I guess three kids really, and they are experiencing a virus called polio. Now, these kids had not gotten a vaccine beforehand, and what's happened is that they have relied on natural exposure to get antibodies for it. And this was before the polio vaccine was even invented yet. And these kids, or this virus has attacked their bodies. And for this child here, they have lost their ability to walk, so they've become partially paralyzed. And these children here, they can no longer breathe by themselves. So they're in this contraption known as an iron lung, which is pumping their air or decompressing their lungs and forcing them to breathe. Okay, so this is why vaccines are very important because they allow us to get those exposure to the antigens to create our own antibodies without the risk of more harm by just getting naturally exposed. Passive immunity, on the other hand, occurs when we are protected from a pathogen by antibodies gained from someone else. Now, this is only their antibodies that we are given. Okay, so there are two types of passive immunity. We have maternal, which is natural, or something called an antibody infusion. Now it's really important to note here that passive immunity is not permanent. Okay. Um, so when we're having a look here, right, we as babies receive antibodies from our mother through breastfeeding, through the placenta, and even through the vaginal tract here. Okay. So I want you to think about what some of the complications are for a baby who has been born through a C section or a baby who has had a natural birth, and think about the effects of the antibodies there. Now, the reason why our antibodies gained through passive immunity do not last forever is because the antibodies themselves that have been secreted from our B cells and things like that, they can't be recreated because our body doesn't actually have the B and T memory cells. It wasn't them that created it, right? It was only just something that's already been created by them. So really, you can think of it as the B and T memory cells have the recipe, right? And the antibodies are just the product of that recipe. So if you're only just giving someone the antibodies, you're just, I guess, giving someone a plate of cookies and they can't recreate it because they don't have your recipe. Okay, so that's why it's not forever thing there. And then, like I said, the other thing that can be another way we can get passive immunity is through antibody injections. So this can be particularly useful for maybe the elderly or someone who is more vulnerable to the pathogens and to infections that could be a bit more life threatening. So maybe they quickly need that antibody injection to ensure that they are safe. You can also get it when people get snake bites and things like that. Venom, right, also has their own antigens, so you might give an antibody injection for that too. But of course, passive immunity, like I said, it is important specifically for unborn babies. They do not have a developed immune system, and also provides protection against particularly harsh pathogens. Where, like I said, if you're someone a bit more vulnerable and maybe this pathogen would result in death if not acted on immediately, then it's going to be very helpful for you to get that all under control. And then here's different types of ways that we can acquire immunity from our acquired immune system. Permanent, not permanent. So one is definitely better than the other, but some of these we cannot help but need to have.